Our own American government calls Islamic Saudi Arabia an ally, a country that routinely executes people for trying to escape from the Islamic religion, and makes its women walk around in big black bags they call burqas, always 3 steps behind their male abusers, and won't even let those women drive cars. And here recently Saudi Arabia imprisoned Samar Badawi for dissidence, someone to whom both Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton together gave the 2012 Woman of Courage Award, and yet we still call Saudi Arabia an ally. What a disingenuous joke. That's as bad as our country cozying up to China, because China, to this day, still persecutes both Christians and the Falun Gong, and suppresses as well many other human rights as basic as its people's right to freedom of religion. Saudi Arabia is the #1 funder of the spread of Islam worldwide, and the particularly violent Wahhabi form of Islam at that. Probably because Islam honors Saudi Arabia as its birthplace, forcing its adherents to bow 5 times daily toward Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, and forcing them as well to acknowledge that Saudi Arabia's Arabic language, the language of the Quran, is the world's only perfect language, for example, by discrediting vernacular translations of the Quran, and forcing them as well to make the Hajj, which is an annual Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, to deposit regularly their tourist dollars into Saudi coffers there. The Obama family has never been in any danger of attack from any of the Muslims that President Obama has welcomed into our country. The same president who, as a Muslim sympathizer, has consistently refused to admit the obvious fact that Muslim violence has been directed toward particular religious groups. Because the Obama family live in their White House mansion, protected by the Secret Service, as well they should be, but it is we, the unprotected little people, whose security has been jeopardized by direct exposure to Muslim immigration. For example, by the Muslim attacks at the Army base in Fort Hood, at the Marathon in Boston, at the county offices in San Bernardino, at the nightclub in Orlando, at the combined targets of the neighborhood in Chelsea and the U.S. Marine Corps charity run in Seaside Park, and most recently at the shopping mall in St. Cloud. And what a waste of time it was for our leadership to try to prove a link between those murderers and outside terrorist groups. Because it is the Koran, all by itself, that indisputably and unequivocally teaches its followers to murder, hurt, terrorize, and conquer innocent and unarmed people throughout the entire world. So no external group is needed. The known Islamic terrorist groups, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are what they are precisely because they follow the precise teachings of the Quran. And now is not the first time that the world has ever seen Islamic terrorist groups. For between 1912 and 1930, Saudi Arabia was terrorized by an Islamic terrorist group called the Ikhwan, a group that actually was formed by the Saudi leadership, but turned on that very Saudi leadership that had formed them when they read what was in the Quran. And a group that, although perhaps employing similar terror tactics, yet because of time differences, could not possibly have been connected with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any other modern Islamic terrorist group, except that all those groups read or read the same horrific passages in the same horrific Quran. It is we, the little people, on whom even mainstream Muslims want to impose their loveless false morality. For example, by wanting to censor our books and other media, by wanting to outlaw, or at least to regulate, our music, sports, and fashion, including wanting to clothe our women from the tops of their heads to the bottom of their feet, and even their faces, and even on scorching hot days. A first step in that direction recently being taken by the Islamic mayor of London when he banned bikinis in advertisements. The same mayor who also at one time quipped that terror attacks are part and parcel of life in a big city. By wanting to mutilate our thieves, who then will never be able to work themselves legitimately out of their poverty. And by wanting even to deny us a refreshing beer every once in a while. And perhaps worst of all, by wanting to wake us up at 5:30 in the morning with horrible singing for a Muslim call to prayer. Now we must caution ourselves to be discerning regarding individual Muslims, because many of the people who call themselves Muslim secretly hate Islam because Islam was forced upon them against their will in their native Islamic countries. Such Muslims are as much the victims of Islamic power brokering as we outsiders are, so we should provide such Muslims with a safe haven in which they may hear of other religious options and freely choose their own path, or no path at all if that is their sincere desire, a common courtesy and basic human right that was never extended to them in their Islamic homelands. Middle Eastern Muslims who have been making it as far away from their Islamic homelands as the safe haven of Western Europe have indeed, by all accounts, and in spite of the world-conquering premises of the Islamic Hijrah, been converting away from Islam in record numbers, which, even if their motive in some cases may have been simply to help them possibly to secure asylum status in their new countries, nevertheless shows us how little many everyday Muslims actually care for their Islamic religion. All of the foundational religious texts that I earlier mentioned to you as my having read, I would never have been allowed to read in any Islamic country, because the Koran is anti-religious diversity. I've often wondered why the modern Iranians, the descendants of the ancient Medes and Persians, follow Muhammad instead of their own ancient national prophet, who is Zoroaster, sometimes called Zarathustra. Because Zoroaster, unlike Muhammad, extended grace to other religions, as exemplified by the Old Testament story of the ancient Mede and Persian disciples of Zoroaster under their kings Cyrus and Darius, allowing the exiled Jews to return to their own destroyed city of Jerusalem and to rebuild it, including the temple there. And even the so-called wise men who came to worship the infant Jesus are thought by many to have been Zoroastrians. But I assume that Iran's abandonment of Zoroaster is due to the fact that Iran still lies vanquished under the sandaled foot of its original and brutal Arab Islamic conqueror. Too bad for Iran, because they would probably be a better country today if they would have stuck with Zoroaster. Zoroaster, after all, is that prophet who introduced to the world the beautiful and ennobling concept of spiritual light overcoming spiritual darkness, which is the heavenly war between Zoroaster's deities, who are Ahura Mazda and Angar Mainyu, a war in which even we lowly human beings play a role. But under Islam, poor Iran has known only spiritual darkness. We must also be individually discerning, because there are other people who call themselves Muslim who are truly good and kind people. But this is because they are not true Muslims. Rather, they are Muslims in culture only and do not take the Quran seriously, or at least not the violent parts of it, or perhaps may not even be aware of what the Quran actually says, because any Muslim who is not killing infidels, killing apostates, beating women, lopping the hands off of thieves, or spreading terror, especially by cutting off heads, is clearly not following the indisputable and unequivocal teachings of the Quran. Such nonviolent people, of course, have the right to live out the ways of their culture, provided, of course, that they do not try to impose those cultural ways on those of us who do not want them, which, unfortunately, many of them try to do. But any host country that is generous enough to allow immigrants to enter within its own borders must not be expected to assimilate to the ways of the immigrants. Rather, the immigrants must be expected to assimilate to the ways of the host country, because that is what immigration means. If the ways of the host country were not better than the ways of the country from which the immigrants emigrated, then the immigrants would not be wanting to enter the host country in the first place. Because assimilating to the ways of our great country, the USA, requires abandoning all prejudicial religious violence, all immigrants to our country should be required to sign a document renouncing all the violent passages in whatever religious text they claim as their own, whether that text be the Koran, the Torah, the Mahabharata, the Guru Granth Sahib, or whatever. But our main emphasis must be the Koran, not only because the violence called for in those other books is mitigated somewhat by certain prescribed limitations on that violence, which we covered earlier in my presentation to you here today, while the violence called for in the Quran is virtually unlimited, but also because Muslims have historically demonstrated that they are far and away the most likely of all religious adherents actually to commit the violent acts called for in the religion's foundational text, though the least likely of all religious adherents to admit to that violence. All the times I have questioned individual Muslims about the violent passages in the Koran, they have invariably deflected that question to a question about the unrelated violence in the United States, as if by citing someone else's general violence, they were somehow mitigating their own general violence. Sharia law in particular, that murderously and sadistically violent form of law enjoined by the Koran, and which form of law is almost as murderous and sadistic as the ancient law of Moses, should have no place here. It is to the great shame of our country that we have allowed great American cities, such as Dearborn, Michigan, home of America's iconic Ford Motor Company, to become so Sharia that no religion other than Islam is permitted even just to be spoken of there. Whatever happened to American freedom of religion?